suspects are being. One case involves the FBI is now offering $100,000 to see for the police are releasing.
Welcome to Missy Mysteries, a true crime and paranormal podcast. With the start of the holiday season, I want to talk about a case that truly bothers me. I first heard this case on Crime and Compulsion podcast and think about it often. This week, I'm going to be telling you about the case of the missing Sodder children from Christmas Day of 1945. Let's take a quick break before jumping into the case. I'm going to be playing a short promo for the podcast Scottish Murders.
I'm Dawn.
And I'm Cole.
And Scottish Murders is a true crime podcast dedicated to people from or living in Scotland.
Just like anywhere else in the world, these murders can be truly horrific and shocking, and we want to shine more light upon them.
Join us every 2 weeks on Scottish Murders, where we'll bring you cases both solved and unsolved, giving you an insight into the other side of bonnie Scotland.
Find us wherever you stream your podcasts, as well as on social media.
Join us there. Bye!
Welcome back from the break. Personally, Scottish Murders is one of my favorite podcasts and couldn't recommend them enough. George Sodder, father of the Sodder children, was born in 1895 in Tula, Italy. At just 13 years old, he immigrated to America with his older brother, but his older brother did not stay with him. As soon as George was cleared at Ellis Island in New York, his brother left to go back home to Italy. George found work in America working the railroads in Pennsylvania. He would carry water and supplies for the other workers. After years of being in America, he started a different career-based job in Smithers, West Virginia as a driver. He then started his own trucking company hauling dirt and coal for construction sites. This is when he met his wife, Jennie, mother of the Sodder children, who had also immigrated to America from Italy. George and Jennie settled down in Fayetteville, West Virginia, which had a big community of Italian immigrants and Italian Americans. They lived in a 2-story timber frame home where they welcomed all 10 of their children into the world, the first in 1923 and the last in 1943. George's trucking business had been very successful, and they were known as one of the most respectable middle-class families around. Even with this title, it didn't mean that everybody got along with the Sodder family. George was very open about his dislike and unfavorable opinions about the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, which led to arguments with other people in the Italian community. By 1945, Mussolini had been deposed and executed, but George's opinions of Mussolini still left a sour taste in the mouths of people in the community. In October of 1945, the salesman tried to sell an insurance policy to George, but when he denied his offer, the man was angry, telling George, "Your goddamn house is going to blow up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed. You are going to pay for your dirty remarks you have been making about Mussolini." During this time, the salesman wasn't the only strange person to come around the Sodder family. One man approached George outside the home looking for work. When George told him he didn't need any workers, the man looked at the fuse boxes on the home and told George, "This is going to cause a fire someday." George thought this man was strange, and his remarks even more, since he had just had the electric company come out to inspect the wiring on the home. They had told him everything was in good shape. The last strange person noticed by the Sodders was seen just around Christmas time. The older Sodder boys, John, the oldest child, at 23, and George Jr., the 4th child, at age 16, noticed a man parked on the road near the Sodder home. This man was watching the younger Sodder children come home from school multiple days in a row. On December 24th, 1945, the Sodder children were celebrating Christmas Eve together. Marin, the oldest girl at the age of 17, had been working at the dime store in Fayetteville. She brought home toys for her younger siblings, Maurice at age 14, Martha at age 12, Louis at age 9, Jennie, named after her mother, at age 8, Betty, age 5, and Sylvia, age 2. George and Jennie went to bed at 10:30 p.m. that night with Sylvia, who slept in her parents' bedroom. The other children wanted to stay up and play with their new toys, and their parents agreed as long as Maurice and Louis remembered to close the chicken coop and feed the family's cows before they went to bed. Around midnight that night, Jennie, the Sodders' mother, woke up to the sound of the home phone ringing. When she answered the phone call, a woman with a weird laugh asked for a name Jennie had never heard before. Jennie told the woman she had the wrong number and ended the call. During the call, Jennie could hear glasses clinking and laughter on the other end, but didn't think much of it, especially because it was Christmas Eve. As Jennie made her way back up to the bedroom, she noticed the house was quiet, but something more unusual. The children usually locked up the house, but all the curtains were still open, the lights were on, the door was unlocked, and Marin was sleeping on the couch. She locked the door, closed the curtains, and turned off the lights, leaving Marin on the couch, assuming the other children had gone up to bed in their room up in the attic. At 12:30, after half an hour had passed, Jennie woke up to the sound of what she described as something hit the roof, like a rubber ball. It rolled and hit the ground with a thump. She brushed the sound off and went back to bed till 1 a.m. when she smelt smoke in the house. Jennie and George ran out of the home, grabbing their toddler Sylvia, and on their way out the house since she had slept next to their bed. George yelled up the staircase that was filling up with flames up to the attic, hoping to get the 5 children out, but he heard no responses. George, Jennie, Marin, John, George Jr., and Sylvia got out of the burning house, but the other 5 children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, the Sodder's daughter, and Betty, were still in the house. If you remember, I said the Sodders had 10 children. Family count at the time seems a bit off, but that's because their son Joe, aged 21, wasn't living in the home at the time. He was off fighting in the army. Jennie, the mother, described waking up in the house on fire and trying to get the children out. She said, "I ran to the bottom of the stairs where the children were supposed to be sleeping. I yelled and yelled, and the 2 boys, John and George Jr., came stumbling down. Their hair was singed by the flames." George, seeing his house in flames and knowing 5 of his children were in the home, he had to do something to rescue them. George and the older boys tried to go back into the home by climbing a wall and breaking a window, but all this did was leave George injured. They thought of the ladder that George had always left on the side of the house for regular maintenance, but it wasn't where it should have been. The ladder was somehow in a ditch by the Sodders' home. As George tried to use the ladder to rescue the children from the attic, Marin ran to the neighbor's home to call the fire department, but couldn't reach an operator. After Marin couldn't reach an operator, the neighbors went to a nearby tavern to try to call again, but they couldn't reach an operator either. This is when they went into town to find the fire chief F.J. Morris and told him about the fire and the children stuck inside the home. He then began the chain of calls to his firefighters. At this point in time, the fire department was understaffed because of World War II. Morris would call one firefighter, and they would call another in a chain of calls. During the time waiting for the fire department, George tried different methods to rescue his 5 children. He tried to use a bucket of rainwater to put the fire out, but it was frozen into ice on the cold night. He then moved to his last attempt. He had 2 work trucks, and his plan was to drive one of them up to the side of the house and use the top of the truck to climb in to get the children out. When he went to start the trucks that he had used the day before, none of them would start. The Sodder family that got out had to wait for the fire department for hours as they watched their home that their children and siblings were in burn to ashes within 45 minutes of starting. The fire department that was only 2 miles away didn't get to the Sodder home that started to burn at 1 a.m. till 7 a.m. on Christmas morning. By the time they got there, the home was simmering ashes, and the search for Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty began. By 10 a.m., with no signs of the children found, the state police had said that the cause of the fire was faulty wiring. The police chief had said the children's bones must have been obliterated in the fire. F.J. Morris, the Fayetteville fire chief, conducted his own investigation, finding no evidence of remains or anything to contradict the faulty wiring finding from the state police. I am not in the firefighting business or the mortuary business, but I'd like to go over the probabilities of finding no bones or remains of 5 children after the fire. An average house fire, according to FirefighterInsider.com, burns at 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. That is 815 Celsius, and it tends to burn hottest at the top of the home, where the attic would be, and where the children were sleeping that night. The home burnt for 45 minutes. According to multiple sources, during the cremation process, the heat used is 1,400 degrees to 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, or 760 to 982 Celsius. The whole process takes 2 to 2.5 hours, but the deceased person isn't ashes when they come out. What's left is their skeletal remains. Sometimes bodies even need a second time in the incinerator. The skeletal remains and bone fragments are left to cool and are searched for any metals that didn't burn in the incinerator. The remains are then put in a machine called the cremulator, where the skeletal remains are ground into the finer ash and sand like remains that are normally seen. Most likely, if the fire was burning for 45 minutes, even at a regular house fire temperature, that at least some bone fragments or skeletal remains should have been found from the 5 children, especially since small appliances and other things had been found in the remnants of the home. But when Charles Payne, a worker from the funeral home, came to the Sodder home on the 26th to collect the remains, he couldn't find any remains on the scene. George, thinking his 5 children had been essentially cremated during the fire, decided to make a memorial on the side of the home. He covered the basement that was left with 5 feet of dirt to turn the site of the home into a memorial flower garden for the children. Days after the Sodder fire, a jury came together to rule the cause of the fire as faulty wiring. Oddly, one of the men in the jury was the salesman who told George his home would be burned and his children would be destroyed. On December 30th, 1945, after this ruling, death certificates for 14-year-old Maurice, 12-year-old Martha, 10-year-old Louis, 8-year-old Jennie, and 6-year-old Betty were issued, listing their cause of death as fire or suffocation. Shortly after the death certificates were issued, the Sodders started to wonder if their children could have survived the fire. Jennie started to conduct experiments of what could have happened to the children for herself. But before I talk about those, let's hear a little bit more about my sponsors for this episode, Anchor. Welcome back. Have you heard of Anchor? Anchor is the easiest way to make a podcast. When I started Misty Mysteries, I didn't know where to go, and Anchor helped me get Misty Mysteries started without charging me an arm and a leg. Anchor is really my suggestion for anyone looking to start a podcast. It has tools that allow you to record and edit in-app or on the website. Anchor distributes your podcasts on all the listening places such as Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Good Pods, and all your favorite listening places. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place, and best of all, it's totally free, all on Anchor FM and on the Anchor app. In the break, let's hear more about Jennie's experiments. Jennie would burn bones from animals, including chicken bones, beef joints, and pork chops, to see how much of the bones would be left after burning them. She was normally left with charred beef, chicken, and pork bones. After these experiments, the Sodders would start to put together more strange and suspicious events around the fire, such as the cause of the fire being faulty wiring. But the family remembered that their Christmas lights were still on because Jennie recalls that the lights guided the rest of the Sodder family out of the home. They didn't understand how the Christmas lights would still be on if the wiring was faulty and the wiring had been cleared by the electric company when George had to put in a new stove. A telephone repairman had come by and also told the Sodders that their telephone line had been cut and not burnt. Along with working Christmas lights and a cut telephone line, a witness had also come forward to tell them that he had seen a man with a tackle and block used to take car engines out on scene of the fire. The night of the fire, Jennie recalled hearing a loud thud on the roof of the home, and nothing came of that till Sylvia, the youngest Sodder child, found a hard rubber object on the property while Jennie was working on the garden. After looking at the object, George thought it looked like a napalm, or better known as a pineapple bomb used in war. Shortly after this discovery and all the odd events, they started to get calls from people who believed they had seen the Sodder children. One woman claimed she had seen the children looking out of a car while the fire was burning. Another woman who operated a tourist attraction in Fayetteville and Charleston, West Virginia, said she saw the children on Christmas morning. She told the police that there was a car with a Florida license plate. One woman at the Charleston Hotel saw the children's photo in the newspaper and said she had seen 4 of the 5 a week after the fire. The children were accompanied by 2 women and 2 men, all of Italian descent. In the statement, she also said, "I do not remember the exact date. However, the entire party did register at the hotel and stayed in a large room with several beds. They registered about midnight. I tried to talk to the children in a friendly manner, but the men appeared hostile and refused to allow the children to talk to me. One of the men looked at me in a hostile manner. He turned around and began to talk rapidly in Italian. Immediately, the whole party stopped talking to me. I sensed I was being frozen out, and so I said nothing more. They left early the next morning." After all of this new evidence and sightings, George and Jennie knew they wanted to get more help from outside sources. In 1947, they sent a letter about the children they believed were missing to the FBI and received a reply from the then President, J. Edgar Hoover, saying, "Although I would like to be of service, the matter related appears to be a local character and does not come within the investigation jurisdiction of the Bureau." Hoover's agents said they would assist if they got the permission from the local authorities, but the Fayetteville police and the fire department declined the offer. Without the help of the FBI, the Sodder hired a private investigator to help them, named C.C. Tinsley. Tinsley was actually the person who discovered that the salesman who threatened the home and the children was a member of the coroner's jury that deemed the fire as faulty wiring. He had also uncovered a story about F.J. Morris, the fire chief. Even though he claimed to have found no remains, he had confided in someone that he had discovered a heart in the ashes of the Sodder home. He hid it inside of a box and buried it on the Sodder property. After hearing this story, the P.I. Tinsley got Morris to show him where the buried heart was. The two dug it up together. The heart was taken to the local funeral director, who found the heart was a beef heart. Then more rumors started around town. The rumors this time was that the fire chief brought in the heart himself and buried it on scene in hopes that finding the heart would stop the Sodders from further investigating the situation. Years passed with tips and leads coming in, and George himself would chase some of them. One in particular was a photo of a little girl he saw in a newspaper that looked like Betty. George drove to Manhattan to see the girl for himself, but her parents refused to speak to George, and he had to go home. In August of 1949, the Sodders brought in a Washington, D.C. pathologist named Oscar B. Hunter to research the site of the fire and excavate it thoroughly. He uncovered several small objects, including damaged coins, a partially burnt dictionary, and several shards of a vertebrae. Hunter sent the bones to the Smithsonian Institution and got back these findings. The human bones consisted of 4 lumbar vertebrae belonging to one individual. Since the transverse recession are fused, the age of this individual at death should have been 16 to 17 years old. The top limit of the age should be 22, since the center, which is usually fused at 23, are still unfused. On this basis, the bones show greater skeletal maturation than one would expect for a 14-year-old boy. It is, however, possible, although not probable, for the boy of 14 and a half years old to show 16 to 17-year-old maturation. The oldest of the Sodder children believed to have died in the fire was 14-year-old Maurice. The vertebrae also showed no signs of being in a fire. The reports added, "It is very strange that no other bones were found in the allegedly careful excavation of the basement of the home," noting that if the fire had burned for half an hour or so, it is said one would expect to find full skeletons of 5 children, rather than only one vertebrae. The bones and the report concluded that these were most likely in the supply of dirt George used to fill in the basement to create the memorial for the children. The vertebrae also had no signs of being in a fire. The report promoted the capital of Charleston to have 2 hearings involving the Sodder family and their home. During these, the governor at the time, O.K.L. Patterson, and the state police superintendent, W.E. Burchett, told the remaining Sodder family the search for the missing children was hopeless and closed the case. George and Jennie would never give up hope finding their missing children, and didn't find the case hopeless. They started to pass out flyers and put a billboard of the children up on Route 16. They offered a reward of $5,000 for information leading to the discovery of their children. They soon bumped it up to $10,000. A letter arrived soon after from a woman in St. Louis that told the Sodders that Martha, who was 12 at the time of the fire, was at a convent in St. Louis. A person in Florida claimed the children were staying with a relative of Jennie's, and one tip came from Texas, where a customer said they heard a conversation about setting a fire in West Virginia on Christmas a long time ago. George traveled all over to follow up on these leads, but also returned home with nothing new. 20 years after these tips, in 1968, Jennie got an envelope in the mail, postmarked from Kentucky, but it had no return address. Inside of the envelope was a picture of a man in his mid-20s. On the backside was cryptic handwriting that read, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, LLIL boys, A90132 or 35. Jennie and George couldn't deny that this picture looked similar to Louis, who was 9 years old when the fire happened. Beyond his similar features, dark curly hair and dark brown eyes, they had the same straight, strong nose, the same upward tilt of their left eyebrow, but instead of George going this time, they hired a private investigator who went to investigate, but never came back to the Sodders. The family was scared that if they published this letter and name of the town it was postmarked from, Louis may be harmed if it was him. Instead, they added the updated picture of Louis to the billboard and hung up an enlarged version of it over their fireplace. George, in an interview, said, "Time is running out for us, but we only want to know if they died in the fire. We want to be convinced. Otherwise, we want to know what happened to them." George passed away in 1968, shortly after, never knowing what happened to his 5 children on Christmas Day of 1945, but hoping the family would find out eventually. After George's death, Jennie built a fence around the property and began to add rooms onto the house. Jennie also wore black every day, but she had done that since the fire in 1945, as a sign of mourning. Jennie passed away in 1989, and the billboard of her 5 children didn't come down till she passed away. Jennie and George both passed away, hoping to know what happened to Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty. But their children and their grandchildren have never stopped looking. They even made theories of what could have happened. One theory being the local mafia had tried to recruit George, and when he denied their offer, they tried to extort him for money, for which he refused. In return, they kidnapped the children while the door was unlocked. Some also believe they could have been taken by Mussolini supporters. Even though he had been executed at this time, they took the children and shipped them off to Italy to be raised. Both of these stories, they burned the home to get rid of the rest of the Sodder family. Some say they were taken by people to protect them from the mafia, who were upset with George and for the rest of the family's safety never contacted them. After 70 years have passed, their family has never given up finding them. Sylvia Sodder, who was 2 at the time of the fire, passed away this year in April, but promised to keep the story told for her parents and siblings. She believed her siblings never passed away in the fire. We may never know exactly what happened to them that night, and if the 5 Sodder children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty, passed away or were kidnapped, but we hope that one day we will find answers for the grandchildren of the Sodders. Thank you for listening to Misty Mysteries. If you like this podcast, I would like if you headed over to where you listen to not only leave a 5-star review for Mystery Mysteries, but to subscribe to listen each week. If you want to own your own merch, Misty Mysteries is happy to say we now have our own merch store. If you don't want to commit to a new shirt or sweater just yet, we also have mugs and masks. Till New Year's, every purchase on the shop is 30% off with promo code HOLIDAYS21. As a thank you for those who listen and support Misty Mysteries. If you purchase within this week, your merch can ship by Christmas. Again, that is promo code HOLIDAY21. You can find Misty Mysteries on your favorite listening places such as Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Good Pods, Anchor, and so many more. I hope you have a great day, be safe out there this holiday season, and if you haven't already, do something nice for yourself.